We begin in the UK, where Prime Minister Liz Truss has resigned just 44 days after taking office. Truss had come to power, promising to rein in the rising cost of living and reinvigorate the slowing economy. But her government's plan to cut taxes unravelled due to a lack of finances, and many members of parliament from her own party threatened to vote her out, prompting Truss to step down.
I came into office at a time of great economic and international instability. Families and businesses were worried about how to pay their bills. Putin's illegal war in Ukraine threatens the security of our whole continent, and our country has been held back for too long by low economic growth. I was elected by the Conservative Party with a mandate to change this. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
Truss will remain in office until a successor emerges. The incoming Prime Minister will have to contend with a host of economic challenges. Prices in the UK are rising at the fastest pace in 40 years. Inflation clocked in at 10.1% in September. The local currency is down by 17% since the beginning of this year against other major currencies. That's hurting demand for goods and services. Business activity shrank by 0.3% in August, and analysts expect the economy to fall into recession next year.
The simple fact remains that the UK has an inflation problem. It's at 10%, around 10% right now, and it's expected to rise further with or without these measures being put in place. Of course, there is still going to be a squeeze. Many people are still forecasting quite a deep recession for the UK next year, but stability where we can is the only thing that we have control of as a country and as a government right now.
We'll discuss this with Luke Bartholomew, who's senior economist at Aberdeen, and Taha, Arvas, who's an economist and adjunct professor of finance at Boğaziçi University. Many thanks for being with us today. So, Luke, I'm going to start with you. On October 31st, Chancellor Hunt is expected to deliver a crucial fiscal statement. What measures do you expect to be announced?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that 31st of October date is looking a little bit up in the air at the moment, given the chaos in the government. It may be that that ends up getting delayed a little bit whilst the new Prime Minister comes in and presumably puts their seal of approval on whatever measures are announced. But as and when it does come, I think what we'd be looking for is around 20 to 40 billion pounds worth of further fiscal consolidation. And that's on top of the maybe 30 billion or so that the Chancellor announced at the start of this week. That number will depend a little bit on what the prevailing level of gilt yields are at the time that the forecasts are done. So the higher gilt yields are, the more fiscal consolidation will need to be announced. The lower gilt yields, and slightly less fiscal consolidation. But we'd be looking at tax increases around things like pension relief and then spending cuts, things like overseas aid, various different capital budgets, and quite significant fiscal tightening coming through.
Right, look, interesting. So further fiscal consolidation, we'll get back to that. But Taha first, Luke was alluding to that just now. I mean, by October 31st, we will have a new Prime Minister in place. So we are in a very unusual situation now of a Chancellor essentially expected to deliver a fiscal statement in around 10 days when he may not even be Chancellor. How do you think all of this is going to play out, first of all?
Yeah, I think there's a major, as Luke kind of alluded to, a major crisis going on, a crisis of confidence in the markets. Really what happened with Liz Truss was the Bank of England essentially threw her under the bus. They sold her out, and they said they wouldn't continue to hold up the gilts and the bonds, obviously. And when that happened, the writing was on the wall. So it was kind of a soft coup, if you will, by the Bank of England against the Prime Minister. So the Bank of England hasn't changed. Will the new Prime Minister change the tone of what's going to happen? Will fiscal policy will the new Prime Minister's fiscal policies gel with what the Bank of England sees as appropriate? Great. If not, then we're going to see the whole thing repeat itself. And I wouldn't be surprised if we go to a general election by the end of the year, or rather it's announced by the end of the year, because nothing has resolved itself, frankly.
Interesting, right. And he probably will change the fiscal tone, Luke, because we know that one of the main concerns from the IMF and not only, a number of analysts, was that essentially we had a tightening monetary policy and a looser fiscal policy, but now things may change. Do you think if we do end up having a tightening monetary policy and a tightening fiscal policy at the same time, is this going to help at all with inflation in the country?
Yeah, it's a slightly mixed picture because one of the things that the new Chancellor announced was cutting short the energy price cap guarantee that the government put in place, which had stopped the full increase in wholesale energy prices being passed through to households and businesses. And that sort of mechanically was going to cap inflation for around 2 years or so. The fact that that scheme is now ending in April means that there's now, I think, upside risk to the path of inflation from about April next year, or at least the headline reported inflation. That being said, I think the deeper fiscal trends are clearly towards consolidation, tightening policy, and it's very likely that the UK is entering into recession next year, and therefore sort of the more underlying inflation pressures, the inflation that's a result of demand running too strong, an overheating economy, that kind of inflation pressure should start to mitigate, even if we are now more exposed to the movements in energy prices.
Interesting, we will touch on the recession as well. Luke and Taha, going into the winter, how big of a problem will inflation be for a country like the UK? Because some analysts say, well, the UK will actually have a smaller problem with it when it comes to energy prices than other European countries. Is that the case? Do you agree?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Taha.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. So the UK is relatively insulated from the energy spikes. The continental Europe is in a much more difficult position, obviously. But having said that, listen, the pound sterling is down 30% almost this year against the U.S. dollar. So while it's important what the Bank of England does and what whoever the current resident of 10 Downing Street is, it may be more important who's running the Fed and who's in the White House. Frankly, because current continued pressure, continued tightening in the United States is going to lead to continued devaluation of the pound sterling. And when that happens, input prices are going to be more expensive. And whatever, despite England, the UK being better off financially, energy independent wise relative to continental Europe, that's not going to help much if your currency is down so much against the U.S. dollar, and input prices are still high. So I don't see inflation going down in the UK in the next year. I don't see it going down anywhere, frankly, in the next year. But if that's it's wishful thinking to think that it will go down, and maybe it will, and that'll be a great surprise. But whoever is in 10 Downing Street, they have a very difficult position coming up for them here.
Interesting, Taha, and all commodities really being dollar denominated. Luke, how do you think the Bank of England will react to this, to potential tightening monetary policy, at the same time tightening fiscal policy? Do you see the possibility of a softer hiking cycle then going into next year at this point?
Yeah, I think the next couple of meetings are going to see quite large increases. The Bank of England needs to catch up somewhat in terms of getting rates to a more appropriate level. And it's been falling behind the curve for the last year or so. So the next couple of meetings are going to be quite big, I think, as the bank tries to re-establish its credibility. But going into next year, I definitely think there are downside risks to how much the Bank of England ends up delivering over the next 18 months or so, at least compared to what markets are pricing in. As I say, I'm expecting a recession in the UK next year. And for all that inflation will be sticky, I think it will also be coming down. And that's probably an environment where the bank feels that, if anything, it needs to start cutting policy again rather than continue to push interest rates up. But for now, it still very much is in a tightening cycle.
Look, many thanks for being with us today. Luke, Bartholomew and Taha, Arvas.